So, sexual selection. We just figured out sex is a good thing, right? Hooray. But as soon as we have sex, a lot of really weird stuff starts to happen in nature. So let's have a look at this clip here.
In Papua New Guinea, the bowerbird has lovingly rebuilt and redecorated his bower. Another visitor. This time, it's a female. This is just where he wants her. Time to begin the show. First, he expands his pupils alternately. It's an oddly mesmerizing display. A spot of limbering up, accompanied by a weird and wheezy call from deep in his throat. Now it's time for his grand performance. He waves his wing like a matador's cape. She appears to be transfixed. This is certainly eye-catching, but it seems he needs to do more. Generously, she drops him a hint. It's the bird equivalent of a bouquet of flowers. It's all going so well, it's time to get physical, with a few headbutts to her chest. One final flourish to cap weeks of effort. But something's wrong. His rival is back, and at the worst possible moment. What should he do? For the female, the moment has gone. Sometimes, whatever you do, things just don't work out.
So this is just one example, and Darwin very famously wrote to his American supporter Asa Gray, saying that a lot of the stuff that's happening in nature, and the famous one is the peacock tail, doesn't really make sense, and you know, to the extent that he felt like it's making him sick, right? Because if you think about it, what we just saw, it does not make sense if you take natural selection seriously. why would any seriously thinking animal go out to these great extents and like do these funny things just to pass on their genes? This just doesn't make sense, does it? And so Darwin famously, in his 1871 book, tried to explain what these major mechanisms are. And it's worth repeating some of the conclusions from that work. As so often, like he was a man of few words, and it took him like 800 pages to succinctly summarize it as sexual selection depends on the success of certain individuals over others of the same sex in relation to the propagation of the species, whilst natural selection depends on the success of both sexes at all ages in relation to the general conditions of life. The sexual struggle is of two kinds. In the one, it is between individuals of the same sex, generally the males, in order to drive away or kill their rivals, the females remaining passive, whilst in the other, the struggle is between the individuals of the same sex, in order to excite or charm those of the opposite sex, generally the females, which no longer remain passive, but select the more agreeable partners. This latter kind of selection is closely analogous to which man unintentionally, yet effectually, brings to bear on his domesticated productions when he preserves during a long period the most pleasing or useful individuals without any wish to modify the breed. So what Darwin proposed here is two different mechanisms of sexual selection, one called intra-sexual competition, the other inter-sexual competition or intersex competition. And so let's have a look at what is going on here. So when we talk about mechanisms of sexual selection, we first have to think about a very curious observation in nature that we already alluded to. It's typically one sex that invests more in offspring compared to the other. Here comes in a very important paper which was largely neglected, written by Angus John Bateman in 1948, and he was experimentally manipulating Drosophila, so fruit flies, and he was measuring to what extent these males and females would be able to pass on their genes and under what kind of conditions. And so he came to some pretty important conclusions. So, for example, he noted that in most animals, the fertility of the female is limited by egg production, which serves a severe strain on their nutrition. In mammals, the corresponding limiting factors are uterine nutrition and milk production, which together may be termed the capacity for rearing young. In the male, however, fertility is seldom likely to be limited by sperm production, but rather by the number of inseminations or the number of females available to him. In promiscuous species, the share of males in the progeny of any female will be proportional to the number of inseminations for which each is responsible. In general, then, the fertility of an individual female will be much more limited than the fertility of a male. This is because in females there are much higher costs, because you have to produce eggs, and you have to take care of your offspring. Whereas for males, it's much easier to produce sperm, and then the only limiting condition is most of the time access to females. So males, their reproductive success is associated with the number of females that they can copulate with, while females, their reproductive success is not linked to the number of copulations, but it rather depends on, for example, the number of eggs that they can produce. So they're more strict biological constraints. So the variability of reproductive success, so you can see the mean here, but also the variability is higher in males than in females, which according to Bateman then leads to stronger sexual selection pressure on males compared to females, because the variability in success is going to be larger in males, because like you have a higher mean if you have greater success in getting access to females, but on the other hand, a lot of males actually will not be successful, right? So you will have a lot of variability. And according to him, this should then lead to stronger sexual selection pressures in males compared to females. Remember that basic principle of selection is always that you have to have variability, so there seems to be more variability for males compared to females. So the Bateman's principle is a really simple way of thinking about how these selection pressures now start working in males versus females, just by the sheer simplicity of their reproduction and their reproduction constraints, right? So for females it's more biological, for males there are no or less biological constraints, and it's more a limitation of access to females. And here comes in our good old friend Robert Trivers, who after he had revolutionized altruism in 1971, he thought like, okay, what other problem is out there? Let's have a look at sexual selection. And he came up with what is called now parental investment theory, where he took the idea that Bateman had and turned it into a kind of general or a more general law. And his argument is that the differential parental investment between the sexes will determine a whole host of biological and social behaviors. And he emphasizes the ratio between the investment in offspring that increase the chances of the offspring to survive and therefore to reproduce right now, relative to the parent's ability to invest in other offspring in the future. So it's this kind of ratio that a parent has to make in terms of like how many resources should I dedicate to this child or this offspring right now compared to all the possibilities in the future. And now the biological constraints come back into the play. So because there are trade-offs that differ for each sex. So eggs are really costly for the female body, and there are just so many eggs that a female could produce and then carry to term. For mammals, there are also huge costs for just the simple fact of developing a placenta and nourishing the offspring during pregnancy and after birth till they're basically independent. In contrast, men are like not burdened with any of these biological constraints. Sperm is typically very cheap to produce, it's abundant, and in a lot of animal species, males do not invest the same amount as females. So most of the time, males just produce the sperm and then just bugger off. And so the ratio is very different for females versus males, because for females, they have limited chances to have offspring, right? Because they have a lower number of eggs. It is more costly to maintain all the biological organs to have offspring, so they are better off to invest in their current offspring and make sure that they are well off. Whereas for males, sperm is cheap, and for them the advantage is, or the ratio is more advantageous for trying to woo as many females and have offspring with as many females and not investing as much in the individual offspring. So there are two different strategies now that come from this kind of biological differential. And so he basically proposed now that the sex that invests more in offspring becomes the limiting resources for the evolutionary success of the sex that invests less. So, which now means that there's much stronger competition among the less investing sex, typically males, because they have to get access to the sex that invests more in offspring and has more biological limitations, which is females. So that's why we have now these two major mechanisms, so intrasex and intersex competition. And this is really an observation or nearly a law that applies for most animals. There are very few animals that are following a different trajectory, and the curious one is, for example, seahorses. The family of seahorses, here males actually carry the offspring, and then like, so basically females just provide the eggs, and the males take care of it. And what is curious is that in seahorses the behaviors switch. So it confirms actually the predictions by parental investment theory that the animal that is more invested in offspring will show different behavioral patterns compared to the animal or to the sex that does not invest as much. So this is really a general law, and this now explains why, for example, we have intrasexual competition primarily between males. So for males, it typically takes what Darwin called the law of battle, which is the competition to gain access to mates and also restrict access to potential mates from competitors of the same sex. And the curious thing is that humans are actually biological species that follows those kind of laws quite well. So what about humans? Do we behave in the same way? Unfortunately, we do. There are some quite controversial studies. So, for example, Napoleon Chanon's work that I mentioned when we talked about the sociobiologist and the human behavior ecologist. His work with the Yanomami in the Amazon basin, he observed a phenomenon called unokai. So unokai were men that earned this title of unokai if they had killed another man or behaved in very aggressive ways to, like scare off others. First, from his observations, first you had to kill someone, and then afterwards you had to always threaten others that you would also kill somebody again. But what he noticed as well is there were relatively few unokai in each village, and a greater number of males were not unokai. But the interesting thing is that unokai on average had more offspring. They were more able to reproduce in a way compared to males that were non-unokai, right? So you had a gradient where these aggressive men were more successful in passing on their genes compared to less aggressive men. So very controversial stuff. But there seem to be also all sorts of display signals that we have. So one of the things, so this is work by Belinda Craig, which was published just recently, looking at, for example, the role of beards and whether beards can help to signal threat to other men. So again, it's an intrasexual competition mechanism here where a beard helps to emphasize anger displays, right? So threat signals, dominance signals. So what Craig and colleagues did is they used models. So they got a person with a beard to model various kind of emotions, and then the same model was asked to shave, and then a beautiful clean shaven baby-faced model would show the same kind of emotional displays again. And then what they asked individuals to do, they gave them there were a couple of different variations of this experiment, but typically it involved people seeing a face, and then they quickly had to indicate what emotion did the person display. And what they found was that over a number of experiments, bearded faces people were much faster picking up angry emotional expressions from bearded faces. So you can see much faster response for bearded faces, and also the error rate was much lower for bearded faces compared to clean-shaven faces. So the argument is that beards may have developed because they help to emphasize certain types of threat displays in male faces, and therefore those individuals with a stronger beard who can therefore use it as a threat signal to ward off other competitors have a better chance to pass on their genes. Hooray! So next time you see a mate with a great beard, think about what is he actually thinking here. I better get shaved, hey? But humans are also kind of weird. Here are some pictures from my family actually. So on the left you see my grandmother, my auntie, my uncle, and some of my cousins, and my mum, and here's my dad with my brother. The weird thing about humans compared to a lot of other great apes is we are actually the males are way more investing in offspring than you would expect if you would look at other apes. So we are somewhat of an outlier. And so this potentially will shift now also some of the sexual selection mechanisms, because now females because as we talked about just before, in most species males compete with each other for access to females. But now because males in our human lineage started investing more in offspring than compared to others, it might well be that there's also female intra-sex competition. And this is where a really interesting research program by Candice Blake over in Australia comes in, because she has started to look into some of these dynamics specifically in an online environment. So, like the famous sexy selfie studies. So let's have a look what she says about her research program and some of the core findings.
Every single day, millions of young women primp, preen and pout in front of their phone cameras, just so they can post an alluring photo of themselves online. Chances are you've seen them doing it. But why does it happen? Are these women just passive tools of the patriarchy, commodifying their own body to suit the needs of men? Well, it turns out that sexy selfies aren't what you might think. We've tracked tens of thousands of social media posts across 113 nations around the world to identify the features that the societies with more sexy selfies have in common. And we find that women are more likely to invest time and effort into posting sexy selfies online in places where economic inequality is rising, and not in places where men hold more societal power and gender inequality is rife. Now, that might sound confusing, but consider the context. Economic inequality increases competitiveness and status anxiety amongst all people in the social hierarchy. It makes us sensitive to where we sit in the social ladder, and in particular, it makes us want to climb that ladder. Now, that income inequality is a big predictor of sexy selfies suggests that sexy selfies, just like other appearance-enhancing behaviours like using cosmetics or even brand name accessories, are actually markers of social climbing amongst women that track economic incentives in the local environment. Now, rightly or wrongly, in today's environment, looking sexy can generate large returns, economically, socially, and personally. In an evolutionary sense, these kinds of behaviours are completely rational, even adaptive. Telling young women to stop posting sexy selfies is like asking them to forego the pot of capital that youth bestows on them, even though that they know that its value diminishes in time.
So this shows the selfie hotspots, and also to demonstrate the relationship between income inequality and human development. So what you can see here, as income inequality rises, there are more hotspots, selfie hotspots, sexy selfie hotspots above the zero compared to below the zero line. At the same time, these effects also tend to be somewhat stronger in highly human in environments with greater human development, where most likely people have easier access to cell phone technology and social media and social networks, social media networks. So this is a really interesting example where a cultural technology influences how sexual selection mechanisms play out. And she also looked into a couple of other predictors, so it was not just sexy selfies. Her team also looked into the availability, for example, of beauty salons or fashion shops, and again they found the same kind of association within and across society. So in situations of greater status competition, so in situations of higher economic inequality, there were more beauty salons and more fashion stores than in those with lower economic inequality. So and this really helped when controlling for all sorts of indicators associated with typically gender oppression. And as she noted, potentially the sexualization, so the use of sexy selfies, can be a marker of social climbing among women that track the degree of status competition in the local environment. So you can think of it as, like the availability of cultural technology such as smartphones and social media facilitating this signaling process. So the income inequality therefore ramps up status competition and therefore strengthens the sexual competition for suitable mates. So this is really interesting in the sense that it shows us a global pattern, but does it actually hold for individual level processes? And this is a follow-up study that they published in 2019 showing that this effect also holds. You can induce the same kind of patterns or similar patterns in individuals experimentally. So for example, they got women to engage in some competitive task, and then the dependent variable that they used was the intention to wear revealing clothes in order to advance in that game. And what they found was it was not so much anxiety about same-sex competition, but anxiety about social status. So your ability to hopefully increase in social status in the social status ladder within the local environment, that was associated with the intention to wear more revealing clothing. So I think it's interesting because her team and their research suggests that this intra-sex competition is driven by to some extent local economic conditions and is facilitated by specific cultural technology that now ramps up these competitions and provides new outlets and facilitating opportunities for these dynamics to take place. So this is a really fascinating study that looks at what happens if the ratio of parental investment changes in a species, and then you have additional variation in, for example, economic opportunities, plus novel ways of expressing the competition using, for example, smartphones and social media. So that's why I think it's a very interesting set of studies.